What is the ego? In the dictionary, you'll read that it's a person's sense of personal identity, self-esteem, or self-importance. These days, the ego has become one of our most despised traits. To have an ego, to be egoic, is seen as a flaw, a character defect, something we should be ashamed of, something we need to set out to dismantle, something we need to abandon. We as a society chase ego death like it's the key to becoming more noble or more loving or more enlightened. We have this imagination that when our ego is gone, we'll finally unlock the depths of love that we're capable of. We imagine that our ego is the thing that's keeping us from real generosity, real peace, and real connection. But what if there's another way? What if instead of dissolving the ego, we decide instead to befriend it? What if your ego isn't actually the enemy, but a misunderstood ally? Today on the podcast, I want to show you the power of relating to your ego with compassion. Not so that it runs the show, but so that you can understand it deeply enough that you can learn to move through its fears instead of being ruled by them. In this episode, you're going to learn how to harness a superpower that so many people spend years meditating or striving or often self-abandoning to find. And if you try this, if you really practice this new way of meeting your ego with presence instead of punishment or shame, I promise your relationships will start to shift. And you'll feel more ease inside of yourself. And the people around you are going to feel more seen and more safe, and more cared for, and more connected to you. So stay with me. This is Reclaiming the Gentleman. I'm Dave Lashansky. So let's start here by getting clear on what the ego actually is. Now, Freud defines it as the mediator between our instinctual desires, our moral conscience, and reality. In modern culture, we've made talk of ego commonplace, though. And in doing this, it's come into a collective meaning that has a lot more to do with self-image than anything, really. Our conversation about ego implies that the ego will always put one's own needs and importance above others to a fault, that it's dangerous. Through our social dialogue, through our judgments a lot of the time, we're taught to have a small ego. And similarly, we're taught to place others' needs before our own. We're taught to sacrifice in the good name of egolessness. And it doesn't come from nothing, right? It comes from seeing men in power who seem to make self-serving decisions all the time. And these are the men we call egotistical. We see the ego as the reason they make these decisions. When we watch people hold themselves with an air of contemptuousness for people around them, we comment on the grand size of their ego. We use ego to mean the thing that makes people selfish. We talk about egoic people as those who hold themselves over and above others. And with this understanding, it is no wonder why we see ego so consistently as the villain, the enemy, the part of us we need to destroy, that we should be afraid of. We see destroying the ego as the solution to our social problems. And here's an example. I mean, growing up, my parents, who adopted a Hindu spiritual tradition when they were young, had a big iron Shiva Nataraj. And if you've seen one, you'll notice that in it, Shiva is dancing on what looks like a baby. And I remember as a kid feeling horrified seeing this and asking, why is he dancing on a baby? And my parents' response was that the baby represents your ego, and Shiva is the god that destroys your ego. Now, without getting into Sanskrit translations and Hindu mythology, put simply, this is wrong. But I remember being struck by that explanation. I remember being struck by all of it and what ego seemed to mean. That it was something to destroy. Something that a god was here to destroy, to squash, to burn away, to make us better. And so I spent much of my early life attempting to be egoless. I would fall over myself trying to be humble, to show up without ego. I would try to transcend it because I was thinking, and I'd been told, and had received confirmation over and over that this was what good people did. That this is what kind and good men did. I learned that humility was the opposite of ego, and that kindness and generosity were the way away from it. But when I encountered the most important struggles in my romantic relationship, I learned how perverted that idea really is, and how flawed that understanding of ego and how to transcend it really is. Because when the mirror was held up for me, and those moments when I was finally, after years of repeated patterns, seeing the stuff that I was missing, the ways of being checked out, the chasms of care that I was missing, the self-protective, the self-preserving actions I would undertake that were hurting my partner and that I was missing. When I finally saw this stuff for what it was, clearly out in the open, I saw how all the programming that I'd adopted in an effort to be a nice guy or a good guy, to be understanding and generous, were all rooted in making sure that who I am is good and kind, and yes, egoless. But by working to protect the image, I was actually being less generous and kind, and definitely less present as a partner as a result. Because the actions that were threatening my image of being egoless, things like trying to make sure that my partner was happy and prioritizing her needs over my own above all else at all times, left her with a man that was actually just burnt out and suffering and resentful. Left her with someone who'd be drained more often than he was present. And in those moments, who couldn't see the impact of his lack of self-care and self-preservation, and how it was affecting his relationship, my relationship. In my attempts to destroy my ego, I was actually inflating it. And I spoke about one of the fights that really awakened me to this pattern in a previous episode. And that fight helped me see that my whole understanding of what my ego actually is needed some work. So in that process and through my training and learning as a coach and facilitator, I discovered how mistaken I'd been about what the ego is. But more importantly, I learned how to make peace and friendship with my ego so that I can choose more consciously how to lead it. And that's the thing I really want you to start to open up to if you're listening to this and aren't quite sure what I'm talking about or where this is going. The goal is not to destroy the ego. The goal is to bring more consciousness to it, to become a more conscious leader of your ego. So we're going to get into what this means, but I want to start with what this means the ego actually is. So I'm going to offer you a totally different take on what the ego actually is. Are you ready? The ego is the part of you tasked with the survival of your human body. The ego is concerned with self-preservation, with keeping you alive. Your ego understands and operates from the needs that it has gathered you have, that it has cataloged throughout the course of your entire life. And fundamentally, it is here to make sure that you're fed and watered and sheltered, but it also knows that you need acceptance from the people around you. You need to be part of a community, to be included, to be loved, to have purpose, right? Those needs are ingrained in your ego's operating system. And when the ego starts to run the show, it is the force that will sacrifice fluffier things like your values to make sure that those needs are met. This is why we see as a society so many egoic men, leaders that seem hell-bent on their own gain, inflating their own image, even when we can see right through it. The ego in those men are the undeveloped parts of them forever, unconsciously seeking the love they never received, running the show because at this point as adults, this unconscious need is the foundation of all their actions. This is why the richest people in the world are often the greediest, and the most powerful people in the world can never seem to get enough. But if we back up to the new definition, that ego is the part of you tasked with the survival of your human body, with keeping you alive, that's not inherently bad, is it? In fact, it's actually a necessary requisite for being a human being on this planet, at least one that exists for a meaningful amount of time. So how can we change our relationship to this necessary and elemental part of us? On my experience, the most profound shift in relating differently to the ego is to get curious. And here's a question that I find really helpful in learning to relate to my ego. The question is, why is it important to stay alive? If the ego is concerned with keeping our human body alive, what's the why? Why does it need to be doing this job? And I think we can sculpt an even more beautiful question with the same essence. And it might sound something like this. What am I here to contribute? Now, all of our egos have created structures around what is valuable based on what is noticeable and tangible. Right? Because I think in our modern society where fewer people than ever are struggling to meet their basic needs like food and water and shelter, the ego starts to over-index on what makes us valuable to our communities, which results in being way more concerned with the identity that our contributions establish for us, more than the actual contribution itself. And this is the lesson I think that me and so many men today are learning together in our romantic relationships. The lesson that the outcomes we want to create are negated when our actions are less about the contribution than about us. When our ego is running the show, this is a hard lesson to learn, but it changes everything. So how do we do this? How do we get to the meaning, the useful way of answering this question without letting the ego take over? Well, it starts by befriending your ego. Befriend it. Make it a partner. Make it a conscious ally in your evolution and your self-development. And here's how to do that. I'm going to give you 2 places where you might be able to notice the ego in action. So here's the first one. I want you to see if you can find an area of your life where you're making sacrifices that you end up resenting. It could be in your work, could be in your intimate relationship, it could be in your family dynamic. But identify a part of you that gives from lack, that overextends yourself and what you have to offer in order to maintain or foster an identity that you think is valuable or that you think makes you valuable to others. Just notice this part of you that wants to give when you have nothing left in the tank, and that gives anyway. And I want you to hold this part of you like you would a child. Hold it with compassion, with care, with sweetness and tenderness. Notice also the part of you that wants to villainize that instinct, and choose to love the instinct instead. This is the way. This is real ego dissolution. When you start to relate to it, when you start to see it for what it actually is. A part of us that has deep misunderstandings about what is actually dangerous for us. That doesn't understand what actually contributes most to our sense of connection and presence and fulfillment. Okay, I said I'd give you two, so here's another place to identify ego leadership in your life. Notice where you feel the need to prove yourself. This could show up in a disagreement, when you're overlooked at work, when you're in a fight with your partner. It could be something subtle, like the way you craft a social media post. Just see if you can catch that flicker of defensiveness, that flicker that feels like an urgency to explain or justify or make someone see you, to show up in a certain way. Make someone see you in a certain way. See if you can hear your ego saying, I'm not safe unless I'm right. Or I won't be loved unless I'm seen as good, smart, strong, spiritual, helpful, generous, whatever it is. What is the identity your ego is attached to? And pause. And instead of pushing that voice away or shaming it, get curious about it. What is this part of you afraid would happen if you didn't prove yourself? What does your ego think it is protecting you from? Maybe the answer will surprise you, because it is not arrogance. It's fear. It is a longing to be valued, to be loved, to be seen. And try thanking that part, welcoming that part, and yes, holding it close like you would a child. Not to give it control, but so that you can actually notice when this part is taking control. Because it is here, and it usually takes things over unconsciously. Doing the work of self-evolution is stepping into the leadership role instead. Because only when you see the ego for what it actually is, and only when you notice when it shows up to run the show, will it learn to trust you to take charge. Will it learn to trust you to lead in the preservation of your human being? Because here's the deal with ego. There is work, there is a way of being in this world that you are called to, that you are here on this planet to do. Whether you know it or not, whether this is conscious for you or not, honestly, whether you believe me or not. And the difference between you doing that in a way that's actually satisfying to you, that tells you that you're on the right path, that confirms for you that that fire inside of you is real and matters, and boy, does it feel good to warm your hands with it. That's not your ego. But if your motivation for doing something, for being something, for creating in the world is to fulfill an identity, is to be someone, it's not going to give you that same juice, that same fervor, that same rush of energy and creative fulfillment. For me, this podcast was living in that world for so long. I didn't make my own podcast in spite of working in podcasting for 10 years because my ego was telling me over and over what to do, how to do it. And it never felt right, and it never came to fruition. It took for me doing this work to be able to create every single week, to put out an episode that is simply me talking every single week, that a version of me before I befriended my ego would have considered the ultimate egoic act. Speaking for 30 minutes by myself. But when I befriended it, I understood that there is a deeper purpose. That being of service in this way is not something that I do for my ego, but it's something I do because it fills me up. It excites me. And that in and of itself is enough reason, is enough juice to keep me doing it. And I don't think that I live in a constant state of being aware of it. It is something that I cultivate. It is something that I check in with. Why am I doing this? What is the fuel here? What is the drive? But I wouldn't be able to actually do that inquiry if I weren't friends with, if I weren't aware of, if I weren't learning about in each new phase of my life, my ego, what it needs, what it wants, and what it fears. And the deeper contribution that makes that endeavor worth the effort and the struggle. It's not ego death. This is ego integration. So befriend your ego and see what happens. See what begins to change when you start to relate to it in this way. Watch as you stop holding your breath quite so often. Watch as you unfold into a deeper way of relating that doesn't need you to be anything, but that is here and whole and genuine and honest. That part of you that attracts what you really want. That is more often than not aware and awake and resourced. Maybe more than you've ever known. See what happens. And let me know. I love hearing from people who've heard the podcast and had moments of presence, moments of waking up, moments of recognition and realization and remembrance. If that's been your experience at any time, please share those wins with me. It's just such good wind in my sails. And the stories I've heard and the things you, my wonderful listeners, have shared with me about what the show has done for you and meant for you makes this all so much more worthwhile and powerful for me. So please do share those wins with me. It makes such a difference. That's all for this week, but as always, please get in touch with questions, things you'd like to hear on the podcast, and yes, your wins. I'd love to share in this practice of becoming more present and more loving humans with everyone. And yes, if you're interested in joining Reclaiming the Gentle Man, the 21-day journey, signups will open soon. Please stay tuned. Please keep listening. As always, this podcast was produced by me, by David Benjamin Sound, LLC. I will actually be on the road this upcoming week. Ron and I are going to Miami to do some wedding preparation, and I might be slow to respond, but there will be another episode coming out next week. And as always, I'm so grateful for your ears, your attention, your presence. It is truly a gift. I will talk to you again in a week. Till then, be well.